Please be mindful to mute your microphone and camera. After her presentation, there will be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, and you're welcome to turn your microphone on at that time to pose questions and speak with Hannah. Additionally, you'll find that the chat box function here in Zoom, which you can use at any time to post questions throughout the webinar or during the Q&A. And please note that one of our colleagues on the reading group subcommittee will be moderating the chat box throughout the webinar. And in case you run into any technical difficulties and need assistance, or if you would like to pose questions during Hannah's presentation, that can be saved and asked during the Q&A on your behalf. And then also, please note that this webinar will be recorded and made freely available on the ACRL YouTube channel. But please rest assured that the Q&A portion will not be recorded, just Hannah's presentation. We'll be providing access to Hannah's slides and a transcription of her presentation over the next few days. Stay tuned on the RBMS listserv for more details. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our wonderful presenter, Hannah Rosen.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me properly. I want to thank Maria for that lovely introduction. I hope that I am as entertaining as she hopes that I am. And I'm here to present on the LYRASIS 2019 Accessibility Report. So this is me trying unsuccessfully to look both casual and professional at the same time. I'm a scholarly communications specialist, which basically means that I work with a lot of vendors to negotiate best prices for LYRASIS members, but I'm also the digitization program coordinator because I have a background in archives and special collections. So I'm delighted to be here today. So just to go over the agenda really briefly, I'm going to be contextualizing accessibility and then talking about the LYRASIS survey. There are 3 sections of the LYRASIS survey, which I'll go over in a minute, but basically only 2 of them really relate to the kinds of collections you're working with in RBMS. So I'm not going to talk about the first one very much. I'm going to talk about the survey results and analysis, and then also just in case anyone would like an introduction, I'm going to briefly go over the web content accessibility guidelines in a very high overview. It's always nice to have definitions that everyone understands. And I certainly know when I started working on accessibility, I knew nada, zip. So I feel that any level of introduction is helpful. So first, we're going to start with some definitions. Well, really one definition. And this is from the Association of Research Libraries website, but it basically says web accessibility means creating digital resources on the web that everyone can use. This involves creating a web that is accessible to people with disabilities that may not affect how they use the web, including but not limited to visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, and neurological disabilities. And it's good to remind yourself that when we talk disability, it's a spectrum. So if you're talking about visual disability, that could mean 100% blindness. It could also mean having low vision. It could also mean being colorblind, or it could mean just forgetting your reading glasses, or in my case, having contacts that are drying your eyeballs out and making it hard to see. Auditory, as I said, could also be a range. Deafness, being hard of hearing, maybe having limited hearing, or maybe not even having earbuds in the environment you're in. Physical disabilities could include having a slower response time, limited fine motor control, or just even being in a situation where there's a lot of physical movement happening around you, or you're physically limited based on where you're sitting. So it's always good to remember that accessibility means being accessible to everyone, whether they have the most recognizably extreme disabilities or whether it's something farther along on the spectrum. Now, there are a couple of case studies I just want to really briefly point out before we get started. The one that has gotten the most buzz amongst universities specifically is the lawsuit against the Los Angeles Community College District that happened in August of 2019. The National Federation of the Blind sued the Los Angeles Community College District, saying that they violated the students' rights under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 by failing to provide them with accessible documents and course materials. Now, that may feel a little farther away from, say, special collections or archives, but it's good to know that when this kind of lawsuit happens, it means that the library has to assess every single resource that they provide online, which means if your collections that you have online, whether it's an image collection, whether it's manuscripts, even whether it's a 3D rendition of, a vase from the 1800s that happens to be in your collection, anything that you put online has to be assessed for accessibility. And if it doesn't meet the standards of the court, it is removed. So if it's not accessible to those people who fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's not accessible to anyone. And that's why this court ruling has created a lot of panic amongst libraries, especially in universities and community colleges, because it means immediate reaction. And it may feel, this one created a lot of waves, but it's certainly not the first lawsuit or legal complaint that has happened amongst the academic world. This is just a small list of universities that have been sued or have received legal complaints from the National Federation of the Blind, including Arizona State, Case Western, Florida State, Fordham, Harvard, MIT, New York University, and there must be a couple dozen more. But this is not just happening in our world. It's happening in other places that may seem ridiculous, but it goes to show that legislation is a really strong factor in how we look at the progress of accessibility. Because, and I'll show you this is a headline that says a deaf man sues Pornhub over the lack of closed captions. And the lawsuit alleged that Pornhub, RedTube, and YouPorn are also in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act because there were not enough captions available on the porn that this gentleman wanted to view. And yes, it may seem kind of silly, but the point is that it is possible to take this kind of legal action against any organization that has content on the web. So now that I've been really scary and weird, let me go on to a different way to think of it. Yes, accessibility is a legal mandate. And one of the reasons why we as a litigious country see these legal actions against our institutions is because there are people who want to access our information. So it might be better to think of it in the sense that it is our mission to make information accessible. And therefore, what these lawsuits are really highlighting is a gap between our mission and our execution. So what we wanted to do with the survey was see, well, where are we? We all want to make information accessible, but where are we? And, can creating a picture of our environment actually help us come to a better consensus about what our action should be? So we had 3 overarching questions that we wanted to ask in this survey. One was how many libraries or archives or a few museums have policies in place to handle online accessibility? What tools and training are at their staff's disposal to assist in these endeavors? And what mandates inform those accessibility policies? Now, as I said earlier, we divided this into 3 sections. The first section of the survey, which is the one I'll talk the least about, was content acquisition. And that basically means any web content that is brought into the library. And that is a lot of your non-unique collections, such as academic journals, ebooks, databases, content that has to be acquired. This is not anything that the library would have in-house, since that doesn't really fall under RBMS's purview very much. I'm not going to talk about it because it's not going to be as interesting. But the next section is sort of much more crucial, content creation. And that means anything that we create within our institutions that goes online. And for this audience specifically, we're talking digitized or born digital archival and special collections materials placed on the web. Any collection that you put up, any finding aid that you put up, that is technically content that has been created and put on the web. It originates within our institutions. So that was the second section. And the third section, which also pertains, is systems. And we did this because we realized, you know, a lot of us have policies for how to make our content accessible. We can prep individual digital items and try and make them as accessible as possible. But we also have to evaluate the systems that we are using to put those materials online. If you're using Content DM, if you're using Islandora, if you're using any sort of online exhibit software, if you're using any databases to have people search your collections, any sort of repository, even if you're using institutional repository software like Digital Commons through bpress to host your unique collections, that is the system that you are choosing to use, which means that whether or not you have a policy for accessibility that informs how you purchase those systems is a big deal if you think of it in the larger context of accessibility. So we received about 200 responses, and after we eliminated all the blanks and the ones that didn't make sense, we had 155 usable responses, which felt pretty good. And the nice thing about that was if we break it down by size of institution, we had a really nice wide range. We had 4 independent archives under other. We had about 10 basically community or public library archives. We had a few government archives as well. And you can see we got responses from associates or community colleges, just bachelor's colleges, master's, doctoral, even a few museums, which considering our distribution channels was really a pleasant surprise. So let's look at some of the results. As I said, I'm just going to briefly touch on digital content acquisition. This was resoundingly pretty negative. 39% of respondents had no policy for how to assess digital content that's acquired for accessibility. Only 14% had a formal policy, aka something written down, and 24% were informal. And other was basically people saying, well, we sort of have one, but we're not sure. And that means that less than 50% have any sort of accessibility policy helping them to evaluate their digital content that they acquire. Now, you'll be happy to know that it looks a little rosier for content creation. You know, does your institution have an accessibility policy in place that applies to the content you create and make available on the World Wide Web? Yes, 28% have a formal policy, 29% have an informal policy. That means almost 60% of basically you guys, almost 60% of people working with unique collections have some sort of accessibility policy that applies to the content that they make available on the web. Now that's much better than the other section. It's still only about 60%, but it shows that this area has a lot more control over the situation. But if you look at systems, it's much bleaker. 55% said they have no policy whatsoever for determining which systems will be used to host content on the World Wide Web. Only 12% had a formal policy and 22% had an informal, which means that only 34% had any sort of idea of even assessing systems for accessibility. So while the previous one looked pretty good, you know, so over 60% have some sort of policy for their content, it's not separate from the systems, which means there's a disconnect with our policies for the content we have and the systems that we choose to host that content. Those systems determine what we are able to do for individual items, which means going forward, the lesson that I took from this was that we need to be much more aware of the systems that we use in terms of accessibility functionality. True, their systems are not our actual content, but they inform what we are able to do. But the other lesson that we learned, I'm sorry, I'm on a little bit of a delay with these slides because the button is right under the Zoom buttons, is that libraries are the most progressive in terms of accessibility when they maintain the most control over their content. So our collections are ours. We know more about them than anybody else, which means we are able to do things like create alternative text for our images. We are able to basically control our ability to describe and present these items. But our systems are usually outside of our realm. They're usually handled either by library IT or perhaps by university or larger institutional IT. And in terms of content acquisition, you know, we have no control over that whatsoever. So the area where we have the most control, we have made the most progress. And I see that as a bit of a silver lining here. You know, we may not be where we should be in terms of accessibility conformance, but it's not for want of trying. When we have the ability to try and meet our mission of making information accessible, then we do better. So I think that says a lot about us and our level of perseverance. And just so you know, when we asked people what type of content they were talking about in content creation, by far the vast majority was born digital or digitized archival and special collections materials, followed by audio and video content. So this survey wasn't just institutional repository stuff like theses and dissertations, journals, scholarly articles. It was all the materials that you are working with. So these results really reflect you. Least surprising results were the mandates, and this was basically true almost everywhere. The Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 were the two most popular mandates because they are the federal mandates that everyone has to follow. Followed by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines because those are the only ones that actually tell you how to do it. And I'll actually go over those three later on in the presentation. But really, there aren't a lot of internal institutional mandates or state laws driving this. This is really a national mandate that is driving all of the work around accessibility these days. One of the most interesting areas that I saw was about training. What training has been provided to help staff understand and implement an accessibility policy? I've put content creation is in the lighter gray and systems is in the darker gray. In content creation, the two most popular forms of training were self-training and in-person training from other staff, which actually reflects the policies pretty well. Content creation, or our collections, basically indicated that when we learn something, we pass it on. As I said, it's this silver lining. When we have more control, we are more likely not only to do the work, but also to educate others in how to do the work. But if you are not lucky enough to have someone in your office who can show you how to create alt text or who can show you how to create closed captions, then self-training is the second most popular result, and followed by webinars. And if you look at systems, self-training and webinars are the two most popular results. And that actually was also reflected in the third section, which means for the most part, when people are learning about accessibility, like everyone who is attending this webinar now, you're probably doing it by yourself and you're probably doing it online. And the lesson I really took from that is, if we are going to make any progress in accessibility, any significant progress, there has to be a more concerted effort to train staff by the institution from top down. Because if everyone is working on their own, we can only go so far as we feel comfortable. For some people that is very far, for some people that is less so. It all depends on your technical level of expertise, your comfort with self-training, which I know myself I'm not great at, and many other, and your resources and your ability to train yourself on your own time. So the biggest takeaway I took from that was that one of the biggest gaps is in training. And if we can do more unified training across an institution, the institution is probably more likely to be able to move forward with their accessibility goals. A less mind-blowing but perhaps interesting slide for anyone who is looking for practical tips. The WAVE Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool is the most popular tool that people use to evaluate accessibility, followed by a lot of features in web browsers, then screen readers and web AIM. But WAVE seemed to be the most popular. And you don't have to write any of this down if you're trying to move, because I'm moving fairly quickly through the slides, because you're going to get the slides afterwards. So there you go. We also had some other overarching questions that we asked in each section. Do you have a timeline for implementing your accessibility policy? Who is responsible for updating your policy? And how is your policy enforced? And I'm just going to show you for content creation the answers, because it is interesting. So we asked, do you have a timeline for implementing your accessibility policy? And the timeline for the majority of people is now. So 10 people said 1 to 2 years, 3 said 3 to 4, only 1 said in 5 years. But the biggest sections were actually all content must conform with the policy at this time, or other, and under other, most people said everything new that we have to put online has to conform. And then we have to retroactively get to all the stuff that was already put there that isn't accessible. So basically, the timeline is now. Because 1 to 2 years, we did this survey last year, the timeline is now. Everyone, basically, their administration is saying you need to conform now, but obviously we're not all there yet in terms of our policy and in terms of our training and in terms of our implementation. So that's where the stress comes in, because the mandate says get ready now, and all of us are trying to figure out what the heck does that mean. Another sort of area of friction is who is responsible for your accessibility policy. And the biggest answer is somebody. The biggest answer is it's all over the place. Outside administration might be in charge, or the library might be in charge, or you don't know and you're trying to figure it out, or there might be a particular accessibility coordinator. But the point is, there's no one answer. It's not like a metadata schema that has been adopted by the entire country. You know, one of the things about the US that makes us different from other countries is that we don't have any nationwide consortia, or basically that are government funded, that mandate certain actions, which means that a lot of our work happens independently. And that also means that how we enforce the work that happens in our institutions differs from place to place. So one of the things that we have to figure out is not only who is in charge, but why are they in charge, and how do we make sure that they enforce the policies? Because a lot of the responses we got for how is your policy enforced was, we don't know yet. We're sort of working on it. We get checks maybe, or if a problem happens, we hear about it. But otherwise, it was all over the place. And that comes back to the fact that conformance is supposed to be now, but we were told to conform far sooner than we were ready to implement. That's sort of one of the main frictions that we saw in this survey. And obviously I'm saying things are kind of messy right now, but hopefully our hope with the survey was that by pointing out that we need to make room for improvement amongst our policies and our training and our documentation, lining up responsibility and mandates and education, we could come up with a community of practice that will really drive us forward. So that is my 30-minute report of the accessibility survey. If anyone has any questions about the report, please put it in the chat box. It is also going to be one of the required readings for mostly the introduction and the conclusion for the reading group that's going to happen in April. But I wanted to take another 10 or 15 minutes and I wanted to give a little context for accessibility, because the report tells you sort of where we are, but if you don't even know what accessibility really means in terms of legal and non-legal mandates, that doesn't help you at all. So I thought we'd do a little introduction into what web accessibility means for archives and special collections. So the two main legal mandates that people talk about all the time are the Americans with Disabilities Act and sections 504 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And if you look at a lot of the court cases or legal complaints, they're always talked about in tandem. Everyone says you have violated both ADA and section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So it might be nice to know what those mean. Basically, they both state in different ways that organizations need to provide equal access to people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires that any person, business, or organization covered under the Act make the information that they provide accessible to anyone. And it was signed in 1990, so it was written to address the accessibility of physical spaces, not virtual spaces, but a lot of court cases have indicated that it applies to virtual spaces as well. But that means that it does not provide specific information on how to make web content accessible. It just says the space that you have where people can go, physical or virtual, has to be accessible. So that basically says you have to be accessible, but we're not going to tell you how. The Rehabilitation Act is also a federal law, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in federal agencies. But that means any programs that receive federal financial assistance, that means any state universities, any state-run museums or state libraries, state archives, they have to comply with section 504 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. Section 508 specifically says federal agencies have to ensure people with disabilities, including their employees and the public, have equal access to electronic information technology. And section 504 says that federal agencies or any program receiving federal financial assistance has to provide individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in their programs and benefit from their services. That's a really big deal when it comes to educational institutions, because basically if you have a student who can't access resources, let's say that there's a history class using a special collections manuscript collection to teach a particular section, if they can't get access to that, that means that they are not getting an equal opportunity to participate in their programs and benefit from the services. So generally, both of these federal laws say that web content needs to be made accessible, but they don't give you any specific way to do this. If you've ever watched The Great British Baking Show, the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act are kind of akin to a recipe in the technical challenge. The idea is, in the technical challenge, the judges tell you to make something incredibly elaborate, like the Charlotte Royale on the right, which looks like a jelly nightmare. But they don't give you the specific steps you need in order to get you there. They say, make it accessible, and they don't tell you. That is where the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines come in. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, are like an incredibly detailed recipe, like a recipe from Julia Child's Art of French Cooking. They are incredibly, incredibly detailed, and they tell you everything you technically need to know to comply with their standards. WCAG was developed to provide a set of guidelines and a specific standard to conform to, and basically, legally, when people say you need to conform to ADA and sections 504 and 508, what they're saying is you need to conform to WCAG. And when we looked at that press release for the Los Angeles Community Colleges, that particular lawsuit, the judge ruled that Los Angeles Community Colleges had to be compliant with WCAG 2.1. So there are very specific results. So what I wanted to do was just point out the 4 main principles of WCAG, talk a little bit about the structure, and then talk about the principles. It would take a month at least to go over every single part of WCAG because it's incredibly detailed, but it looks incredibly scary until you can sort of understand the structure of it, and then it's not as scary. So WCAG has a specific structure. It has 4 principles, and under each one of those principles, there are guidelines. The guidelines provide goals for content creators to achieve to make their content more accessible. But the goals are not specifically testable, so then the success criteria come underneath those, and those are specific and testable. And then there are different levels of success criteria from single A to triple A, and depending on where you are, what institution you're at, they're going to say, okay, you need to hit WCAG, 2.1, and you need to hit all the AA success criteria. And under the success criteria, there are techniques to help guide you to achieve those criteria. So the 4 main principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I'll just move through and do a very high-level discussion of what these are, because I have certainly found for myself and for others within LYRASIS certainly, once you understand these, it helps you better identify problems. A lot of the things that make something WCAG compliant are things that you may not be able to control because they require going into the technical code of a website or of a software that posts online. But being able to talk about it allows you to address the people who can fix any problems. So the first one, come on slide, is perceivable. And the technical definition is information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. You know you're in trouble when the definition uses the word that you're trying to define. So in layman's terms, perceivable basically means that the information must be perceivable using different senses. So if you have visual impairment, there has to be a text alternative for any visual content. So if I have an image of a sailboat, there has to be an alternative way to understand that the content of that image is a sailboat. If you have a video, if you cannot hear, there has to be captions so that you can understand so you can perceive the content of that video. So the idea is, if one sense is not available, are there other senses that you can use to process the information that is being presented to you online? This is the most popular principle, mostly because it's sort of the one that we hear about most because it has the most practical tools, and it's probably the one that we have the most control over. So text alternatives are really popular. One way we can make a more perceivable collection is by providing text alternative for images or videos so that it can be changed into other forms. On the right, you can see an example of alternative text as identified by a tool called Alt Text Checker, but there are lots of alternative text checker. And basically, that's a screenshot of a silent film. And the alternative text is Norma in glasses. Now, that is technically an alternative text, so you could perceive that this is Norma in glasses. But if you don't know anything else about the image, it's not helpful. You'd have to know that it's Norma Talmadge in a film about her having a double identity. Now, you might get that from the context of the website that you're on, but it's also a good reminder that perceivable doesn't just mean putting something in. If you're giving alternative text, it can't just be the bare minimum. It has to be thoughtful, just like any other metadata that you would use to describe an item. The more thoughtful your responses are to creating alternative options for the perceivable guidelines, the better it's going to be for people with disabilities. And it's always good to remember that there's a human component to testing for accessibility. You always want to go through the WCAG guidelines, but you always want to test things as a user. You want to put, it's an exercise in empathy. You want to put yourself in the place of the user trying to imagine what their hurdles might be. So alternative text is the first step. The second principle, oh, sorry, this is just a little subset of perceivable, is distinguishable. So you want to make it easier for users to see and hear content, including separating foreground from background. One of the most popular sub aspects of perceivable is making sure things are good for those with color blindness. So if you put important information in red, if someone is colorblind, they won't know that it's important information. So you want to make sure that any information that needs to be distinguishable on a website is distinguishable in a way that the majority of users can figure out. The second principle is operable. And it says that user interface components and navigation must be operable. Once again, it is not helpful when you have a definition that uses the word in the definition. So when something is operable, it basically means you have to be able to move around the website. So I like to use this example. This is an academic blog post that my husband made many years ago, and he allows me to use it so that no one gets angry. And students might come and read this blog post, or maybe this blog post might even be collected by special collections or archives. If I'm moving around this page with my eyes or with a mouse, it's pretty easy for me to figure things out. I see there's a title on the top. I see there's there's that banner with the pretty picture from the movie What Price Glory. I see that Lance Hunt wears glasses, and that's a blog post, and I can see the recent posts as well. But if you don't have the ability to see the website, or perhaps if you don't have the ability to move your mouse, that makes it a lot harder to move around. So when we're talking about operable, it's what structures and tools are in place to make the website, to allow someone to move around without what we assume is their normal functionality. One of the things you can do is add structure through headings. So headings are used to break up the content into a hierarchical structure, much like an outline. This is within the HTML code of the website. So this is a back-end structural thing to do. Where sighted users can skim a page quickly by reading the visual headlines, a screen reader user, or someone who's basically using this tool that reads the screen, can also skim a page by traversing the headings. So not only do you want to have headings, but you also want to have them to be descriptive enough that if someone, you're creating an outline for the page. So if someone asks the screen reader to read out the headings, they can say, okay, I want to read this blog post, not that blog post. Second level of structure is ARIA landmarks. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And these are specifically designed for enhanced accessibility. You can add the elements to your page to define areas like the main content or the navigation region or the search bar. So the idea is things that you would skim naturally with your eyes or maybe skim over with your mouse, someone with a screen reader could skim them by hearing the screen reader read out what is available to them on that page. And here are just some of the things, some of the ARIA landmarks: navigation, search, main. You just want to get to the meat of the website. There it is. If there's a form that they need to input information, maybe it's a researcher form, that counts too. They might want to be able to say, okay, where's the form, so I can just go to that. And just so you can see, this is the What Price Glory website, but I've used a tool to highlight the headings and the ARIA landmarks. There are some, but you can also see that a couple of them are blank. That's bad. Why is there an empty heading 2? Why are there 2 empty heading 3s that don't make sense? It's not enough to know that the headings and the landmarks are there. You want to make sure that they are efficient, that there aren't any errors. So as I said, it's not just about ticking off boxes in WCAG, it's really using your brain empathetically to see, okay, what would make this experience more difficult? And then in operable, think about sliders and sounds. Do you have enough time to process information? This is a slider. This is a GIF of a slider from the Society of American Archivists. It moves really fast. Some people can't process the information that fast, which means that you always want to have an ability to pause. You always want to be able to pause the slider so that if someone wants to do it, wants to look at an image or wants to read something, they have the time to process it. So things that even seem decorative, you have to think about accessibility as well. And one of the simpler things under the operable principle is don't cause seizures. If you have flashing lights, they can cause seizures in users with conditions such as epilepsy. A website cannot contain anything that flashes more than 3 times in any 1 second period, or the flash is below the general flash and red flash thresholds. This is something to think about mostly if you have audiovisual collections, video or film. But this is a screenshot of a headline that a Twitter user was arrested for sending a Pokemon seizure-inducing GIF, basically to people they knew could get seizures. That's probably not going to happen in our line of work, but rule of thumb, don't cause seizures. I'm running over my time, so I'm going to try and speed this up. The third principle is understandable. That means information in the operation of user interface must be understandable, which means it should not only perceive the content, but they should be able to process and understand it. The success criteria for understandable are less able to be tested by automated tools as the previous 2 sections. But understandable does things that actually should help you. All of these principles should help you make your information more accessible to everyone. But under understandable, for example, it says that you should be at a reading level on your website that is commensurate with the reading level of your users. You know, make sure that you're not using a lot of abbreviations. Make sure that your sentence structure is simple enough that people with learning disabilities or people who may have difficulty focusing on long passages aren't hung up on your website. That's what understandable means. It basically means make your information easy to understand. And the last principle is robust, saying content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. All robust means is it should be strong enough to work with lots of tools. There are a lot of tools out there, screen readers, braille readers, different tools that users with disabilities can use. If your information is robust, it just means that you've made sure that there are no errors in your code. You've made sure that there are no missing headers. You've made sure that nothing is going to basically break the software. It just has, which really you should be thinking about anyways. It's like if you have a website cobbled together with 10 pieces of code over 10 different years, that's not going to be very robust because it hasn't been updated. There's lots of different languages. It's really messy. Robust just means that you have a clean back end that can work with all the different tools available. So just to go over those principles again, if you take away anything from this section of the presentation, perceivable means you should be able to sense things using multiple senses. If one sense can't be used, there should be a way to sense information another way. Operable means you should be able to move around the page multiple kinds of ways, not just the way we automatically assume someone can move around a page. Understandable means that it should be structured and it should be described in a way that is easy to understand. And robust means that your site has to be strong enough to work with different tools. And that is it. Here is a link to the survey, you can also look up the LYRASIS Accessibility Survey Report, and you can find it on Google pretty fast. And now, I'm sorry I took up 5 extra minutes, but I'm happy to stay as long as anyone wants for questions. So thank you very much.